Elden Ring has a serious issue with input drops.
I just clicked that roll button and it didn't fucking...
Where under certain conditions, either your attack inputs or your dodge rolls will inexplicably fail to work, leaving you to be mocked by everyone in your chat as you slowly start losing your shit. And despite what your chat might have you to believe, input drops are a very real thing, and they happen way more often than you probably even realize. But to understand these things, one does not simply pull a line of code in from software games. No, first you have to install 10 different apps, infiltrate their secret modding Discord server, subscribe to some dude's OnlyFans, don't ask me why, I don't want to talk about it, and then proceed to sift through 26,547 lines of code. And for what? Not a whole fucking lot, let me tell you that. In all of these lines of code, there's only a few specific implementations of where the code is handled, where you can kind of assume that something's causing an input drop. For example, one of the major changes in Dark Souls 3 into Elden Ring was the patch to several major glitches, one of these being the Estus cancel. Estus cancel is performed by first drinking your flask, then locking onto a target, causing your character to perform a quick turn animation, and then using a movement cancel on the animation to cancel all other animations being performed by the character. This can be clearly seen in the line of code for Dark Souls 3, and when compared to Elden Ring, the code for this specific animation is quite different. And if you test this by performing an action like a light attack while performing the same inputs that you would for an Estus cancel, then lo and behold, the attack input gets dropped. So you would think that these things are related. The only problem with this theory is that the attack input will also get dropped if you just simply attack at the first frame of the pivot animation, without even needing to move, which kind of, undermines that whole theory. But hey, at least Estus cancel was patched out. Right? Right?
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
Hi, my name's Rust. I'm a Soulsborne content creator with an emphasis on PvP. Input drops can be an absolute bane of your existence, preventing you from being able to attack or roll to avoid a hit at a critical moment in a fight. But these input drops don't happen by random chance, and they have a couple of rules by which they tend to follow. Input drops generally happen for one of two reasons: transitions between continuous animations and pivots. Animations that fall into this category include things like static standing, walking, sprinting, guarding, and crouching. With all of these animations, they apply a certain special effect ID to the character, which the game uses to designate what actions that player has access to during these different states, where if you're crouching, then you'll do crouch attacks, or if you're jumping, you'll do jump attacks. And generally, it's the combination of two or more of these continuous animations and the transitions between them that results in the input drop. As an example, one instance where an input drop is extremely consistent occurs when you're sprinting while holding block, and then you let go of block and sprint at the same time. As you transition to walking from sprinting while moving through the guard state, your inputs will fail to register. Pivots, on the other hand, can be generalized as any movement that causes your character to rotate at a speed above a certain threshold, and this can be subdivided between two types, depending on whether or not you're locked onto a target. And each of these types of pivots are responsible for their own set of input drops. Whenever you're at a walking pace or slower and you're locked onto a target, your character will always be forced to pivot to face the direction that you're locked onto. But pivoting while unlocked has its own set of code that comes with its own set of quirks. To demonstrate, let's take a look at a case of toggling your weapon. While crouched, if you toggle to swap your weapon, you're unable to commit any other action until the other weapon is removed from your pocket. You can't cue a roll, a jump, an attack, or anything. The input just doesn't happen. Not so much an input drop, rather just a period of time where the game prevents you from taking actions. However, if you jitter side to side rapidly while crouching, then you can do weird shit like this. Why does this happen? Well, it's actually quite simple. You see, now that we understand why these input drops are happening and in what conditions they take place, let's go over the 10 distinct input drops in Elden Ring, how they get triggered, and how you can avoid them. Starting off, let's talk about input drops related strictly to the transitions of continuous animations. Standing lock-on pivot. By locking onto a target and forcing the character to play the pivot animation, if you input an attack on the first frame of that rotation, then the input will be dropped. The input has to be frame perfect, so it's not very likely that you'll run into this very often, but simply delaying that input until the character begins to rotate will ensure that you don't get the input drop. Literally just crouching. Crouching is an entirely new mechanic to the Souls franchise, and it comes fully equipped with its own set of various bugs, glitches, and input drops. Quite simply, if you input an attack on the last frame of the crouch transition, then the input will be dropped. This is pretty much frame perfect, and yet I still manage to get this input drop all the fucking time, so don't ask me how to avoid it because I'm the worst at it. Literally just jumping. Similar to crouching, the ability to perform a neutral standing jump is entirely new to the Souls franchise, and there's two ways that this can result in an input drop. Simply inputting an attack on the frame that the game registers the jump input will cause the input to get dropped. This, like the crouch input drop, is pretty much frame perfect, but the window in which this happens can be made a lot wider with a combination of something called a crouch stop. Starting with moving, and then crouching at the same time that you let go of the movement stick and inputting jump will cause the input for an attack to get lost if you cue the attack immediately after the jump input. Guarded crouching. If you hold guard and tap crouch, then any inputs that you make as your character is moving into the crouch state from blocking will cause the input to be dropped, so long as you're continuing to hold guard, making you come back out of that crouch state. If you delay the input till you return to standing, then it won't be an issue. But the best way to avoid this altogether is just to let go of block whenever you're transitioning through crouch. Guard sprinting. If you're holding block while sprinting, and releasing block and sprint at roughly the same time, then during the transition as your character begins to lower their guard, any inputs will be lost. This is most likely to happen when you're trying to keep up pressure versus an opponent without overcommitting to something like a running attack, but instead of going for a standing light attack, you just kind of stand there staring at them like a fucking weirdo. Best way to avoid this, as usual, is to just delay your light attack input until you fully transitioned into walking, in which case you'll appropriately cue your standing light attack. But be aware that if you're holding block and go straight from sprinting to static standing, then you run into a different issue. If you're holding block while sprinting and go straight into a full stop, then your running attack state will get stored, and it'll be stored indefinitely as long as you keep your shield raised and don't move. While this can be a fun party trick, in many cases it ends up doing you more harm than good, so just be aware. Alternatively, if you want to keep up the momentum, then you can unlock from your target and cue a pivot R1 by holding sprint and block and directing your attack in the opposite direction. If you correctly initiate the pivot R1, then you can rotate back toward the opponent as the hitbox begins to generate. It's harder to pull this off, and it's really precise, but if you can get comfortable with it, then pivot R1s out of sprint can be really beneficial for keeping up pressure. Pivot blocking. If you let go of sprint and pivot at the same time that you raise your shield, then all other inputs will be dropped. These might remind you of a certain glitch otherwise known as the perfect block, which works in a similar way by tapping block and releasing sprint on the frame that you get hit by an attack, which will cause you to ignore the hit stun from an incoming attack altogether. It is worth noting that in any of the cases where you get this kind of infinite points event to happen, an input drop is associated with it. Pivot sprinting. Whenever you start your sprint, your character will pivot to face the direction that you're holding the movement stick in. If you then let go of a sprint, then you'll pivot back to face the direction of your locked on target. If you rotate away from the target and then rotate back by letting go of sprint during the first pivot, then any other inputs will be dropped as you transition from the first pivot into the lock-on pivot. Crouch pivots. Starting while sprinting, if you crouch and pivot at roughly the same time, then any input will be lost during the part of that transition. In general, this combination of pivoting while crouching seems to break your character's animations, causing your upper body animations to get desynced from your lower body. You can combine this with a few fun tricks, like using Unsheathed to give yourself scoliosis, or you can use something like a gesture to do whatever the hell this is. This input drop will happen regardless if you're holding sprint or if you happen to let it go. If you let go of sprint, then it'll act the same way, but unfortunately it won't result in any of the fun stuff that goes along with it. Streamer roll. Anytime that a streamer yells,
Bro, this game keeps dropping my inputs, bro. I can't even do anything, bro. Every time it's dropping my inputs, man.
then it definitely was an input drop and not a skill issue whatsoever. But jokes aside, there's one type of input drop that sits outside the norm of how all the others tend to function. And if you watch my video on perfect grabs, then this might sound a little familiar. There's an odd interaction where, if you input a roll on the frame that you get hit by an attack, then your roll will fail to go through, and yet at the same time, the game will consume the stamina cost as if your roll was successful. But if you look at the game's frame data, the iframes given by the roll are meant to start on frame 0.0 of that roll input, being at the same time as the stamina consumption. So how is it then that your roll input is getting dropped while the stamina is still getting consumed? This is actually a much harder question to answer than it would first seem, and the consensus among the various data miners and modders that I talked to all had varying opinions about what might be going on. One speculation had to do with something called race conditions, which basically allow separate threads of code to run at the same time. Rolls, uniquely, don't have their stamina consumption tied to their frame data. Instead, it exists as a separate script which runs in the background. The idea here is that a similar event is happening to what you might see in Bloodborne, where if you land a hit that rallies your HP at the same time that you die, then you can even survive a fatal blow. However, others had differing opinions, in that this might simply be an issue of how the data is processed within a given frame and isn't tied to race conditions, because as one person put it, using threads like this would be incredibly fucking stupid. But all that to say that this isn't so much of an issue of an input being dropped, but rather a bigger issue altogether with how the game handles multiple interactions that occur at the same frame. But the TLDR of how to avoid this problem is just to time your rolls a little earlier so you don't run into this issue. There's so little information provided by the developers on the inner workings of these games, and we as a community have to work together with our shared experience to better understand how it all works. And while that's great for bringing the community together as a whole, it often leads to a lot of misinformation. So all of these input drops are things that I have tested extensively and proven consistent, and anything that I haven't been able to reproduce reliably, I have intentionally left out of this video. In fact, if you feel like you've been having deja vu from watching this, then it's probably because I took the original video down to fix some of my own mistakes that I made. For a while, we've been thinking that it was impossible to input drop a backstab input, but I'm actually just a fucking idiot. Backstabs have some strange interactions that allows them to work where other actions shouldn't, such as in the example of the S's cancel that I showed at the start of this video. Whenever you're lined up for either a backstab or a riposte, then you can cancel a variety of actions by locking onto the target. During that lock-on pivot, you can cancel flasks, you can cancel emotes, hell, you can even cancel this little bell thing. This is likely due to the way that the game handles a backstab queue, where it runs a check to see if your player's position and direction are correctly oriented to cue a grab, and if so, it'll convert your R1 input into a grab attempt. Something about how the game handles that input lets it bypass certain restrictions. Of course, I'm not a modder or a programmer, and while I can navigate frame data in a few lines of code decently well, I generally have no idea what the fuck I'm doing. And when shit gets tough, I always reach out to people that are a lot smarter than myself for guidance, namely people like Amira and Axi. So a big thank you to both of them for their help in this video, and helping me understand the what the fuck I'm looking at. But all in all, it seems like everyone's just as confused as I am. Amy speculated that this has something to do with more of the base level processing of how the game executes the code, which is causing the input drops, and it's not really something that we can just look up into the written code and see a clear answer of where things are going wrong. There's likely some optimization that can be done at the level of the game's code to circumvent these issues, but I'll leave that to the people that are paid to do this for a living. But that's going to do it for this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.